Welcome to From Bankruptcy to Rebirth, celebrating Detroit 10 years into its resurgence. Please enjoy this brief video presentation from JAMS.
In 1979, Honorable H. Warren Knight believed there had to be a better way to resolve disputes, one that avoided the drawn-out processes and high cost of traditional litigation. That vision became JAMS, offering alternatives such as mediation and arbitration to allow parties to resolve disputes on their own terms, in less time, and often at a fraction of the cost of going to trial. Today, JAMS is the world's largest private provider of alternative dispute resolution, handling more than 19,000 cases annually. Our roster of over 450 neutrals includes retired judges, attorneys, and other ADR professionals with extensive experience and subject matter proficiency across dozens of practice areas and industries. We offer customized in-person, virtual, and hybrid resolution options, concierge-level client service, premium technology, and world-class hearing facilities. In addition to our mediation and arbitration services, we offer court-appointed neutrals to assist courts with complex cases, neutral analysis for early case assessments, and mock trials, allowing clients to simulate trial proceedings and refine their strategies. As JAMS continues to evolve, we are embracing emerging technology to streamline the dispute resolution process. Our latest initiative, JAMS Next, introduces AI-powered tools like real-time transcription services and advanced neutral search capabilities. To further address the growing role of technology in disputes, JAMS has introduced the industry's first artificial intelligence disputes clause and rules, providing a clear framework for cases involving AI systems. By integrating new tools, we are continually pushing the boundaries of what's possible in dispute resolution, creating solutions that meet the evolving needs of attorneys and their clients worldwide. One of JAMS' key differentiators is its renowned resolution centers. These centers are specifically designed to enhance the resolution process, offering state-of-the-art technology, private meeting spaces, and flexible setups for in-person, virtual, and hybrid proceedings, all within premium, A-class environments. JAMS is also uniquely positioned to handle complex international matters. We offer state-of-the-art international arbitration centers in popular hubs like New York, Miami, and Los Angeles, and JAMS international rules, clauses, and procedures, providing a comprehensive framework for resolving cross-border disputes. In addition, our partnerships with global ADR institutions further extend our capabilities and reach. With 28 resolution centers worldwide, JAMS connects clients across the globe, allowing them to resolve disputes efficiently and collaboratively. One of our standout locations is the JAMS Detroit Resolution Center. Since opening in 2017, JAMS has become part of a city defined by resilience and transformation. The Detroit Resolution Center has quickly established itself as a vital hub for resolving significant disputes, helping companies and individuals move forward and get back to business. During Detroit's historic bankruptcy, Judge Gerald Rosen led the mediation team that secured an $820 million deal, safeguarding the city's pensions and preserving its cultural treasures. Supporting him were Honorable David H. Core, appointed to mediate critical financial disputes, and Honorable Victoria A. Roberts, who successfully negotiated over 45 labor contracts between the city and its unions. Honorable Philip J. Shefferly, then Chief Judge of the Bankruptcy Court, made the recommendation for a presiding judge to oversee the case and mobilized court resources to support the process through this monumental task. Throughout this time, Honorable James F. Holderman, then Chief Judge in Chicago and close colleague, provided Rosen with personal and professional support as he devoted significant time to the bankruptcy work. Following their respective roles, these key figures have since joined JAMS, expanding an esteemed panel of neutrals resolving significant disputes across the Midwest and beyond. Known for their deep preparation, legal insight, and ability to foster constructive dialogue, our Detroit neutrals excel in resolving disputes in fast-growing sectors like automotive, commercial real estate, and healthcare, helping shape the future of Detroit and the wider Midwest through effective dispute resolution. At JAMS, we view every dispute as an opportunity, not just to rebuild trust, but to reshape relationships and forge new paths forward. Nowhere is this clearer than in Detroit, where Judge Gerald Rosen's leadership during the city's bankruptcy paved the way for a brighter future. We are proud to continue that legacy, turning challenges into progress and conflict into collaboration, striving to resolve today's disputes with the same vision and commitment to a stronger tomorrow.
Please welcome Editorial Director at WXYZ-TV ABC, Chuck Stokes.
Good evening. You can see me, but I can't see all of you. But I can see enough heads to know that there are a lot of people out there. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. This is going to be, I think, a real treat for you, especially if you haven't had an opportunity to read the judge's book yet. But let me say a few things about how this evening's program will work. First and foremost, thanks to the DIA for letting us use their facilities this evening. We appreciate that. As you know, the book is called Grand Bargain, the inside story of Detroit's dramatic journey from bankruptcy to rebirth. Now, the book is 356 pages long, which, according to Obama's book, is short, right? But it's still a sizable read. We can't do the whole book for you this evening, but we can give you some highlights. And that's what this panel is going to do. Hopefully whet your appetite. I understand that all of you will be getting a book. So with the holidays coming, I'm sure the judge won't mind me saying this, that it's a wonderful holiday gift. Okay? And in my business, we don't do a lot of promoting and selling for folks. So Judge, that's the closest I'm going to get to selling the book. No, on a serious note, it is a fascinating read, lots of wonderful stories. You're going to hear some of them, I'm sure, this evening. And it's an easy read, and it gives you real insight to what this city went through and where we are now, and how we can now appreciate all the great things that are happening in our city, a great city, not just recently. We've been great for a whole long period of time. And of course, we don't even want to talk about how great those Lions are right now, right? Let me give you a brief capsule of how this is going to work. We've broken it into 3 panel discussions. In between those panel discussions, which will be about 20 minutes long, you'll see a little video that will help keep that thread moving through here. You'll see different people in the different panels. The biggest challenge this evening, as I face every week on my show, is racing the clock. So we want to be mindful of that. I'll share with the panel as well as all of you. You know, it reminds me of the minister who had a guest speaker one Sunday, and he had invited him, and he knew that this was going to be a great occasion for that visiting minister, and he had told the standing minister that he had been preparing all week long to deliver his sermon. So in a very nice way, the minister of the church looked at him and he said, just remember one thing, you don't have to be eternal to be memorable. Okay? So I say that too in a friendly and loving way to our panel. To keep it tight, there is a clock right in front of me. It's counting us down. I can see it. The panel will be able to see it. And hopefully we'll impart as much information as we can in the time period alone. At this time, I'm going to invite the first 3 panelists up and join me on stage. If you're out there wondering why I don't have a tie on, it's because I knew the governor was going to be here, Governor Snyder, and I knew that if I wore a tie, he would be offended because he set the tradition a long time ago to get rid of those ties. And he promised me that if I wore a tie, he wouldn't answer any questions up here tonight. No, just kidding. But just to be prepared, I do have a tie in my pocket should I really need it. Would you please welcome our first panelist to the stage, and we will begin.
Joining Chuck Stokes on stage, please welcome former Governor of the state of Michigan, Rick Snyder, former Emergency Manager for the City of Detroit, Kevin Orr, and retired Chief Judge of the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, the Honorable Stephen W. Rhodes.
Gentlemen, how's everybody?
Very good, thank you.
Good. All ready for the holidays?
Not quite.
Okay, that means that they haven't purchased gifts for their significant others one yet, so they've got some work to do here, but you can always go down to the DIA bookshop and get something. Okay. Let me begin this. I'm going to start with you, Governor Snyder. We go back a little ways. July 18th, 2013, Detroit files for bankruptcy. The world at that time said, okay, they've got a problem in Detroit. Some of us knew it beforehand, but there are a whole lot of other places it wasn't on their radar yet. As you reflect back, and you've had a good 10 years or so to do so, how bad was it?
Well, Chuck, first of all, I didn't pressure you about the tie thing. You made that call on your own.
That's true, that's true.
But beyond that, let me put it in a bigger context. To me, the issue of doing something about Detroit went far before 2013. When I got to the decision with my family about running for governor, Michigan was a broken state. You're back in 2009. And Detroit was an illustration of being even far worse than the state of Michigan. And I knew for Michigan to come back, we needed to get Detroit on the path to being a great city again. And there were some wonderful things that had already happened, the Illiches, the Gilberts. So the private sector had done a lot. But Detroit was not anywhere where it should be with respect to its citizens and the life they deserved, the services they deserved. So I campaigned on making Detroit a great city again. And you can see, I'm a Republican governor candidate. I opened a campaign office in Detroit. I walked the streets of Northwest Detroit knocking on doors. And I knew I wouldn't get votes, but I wanted to send the message that people cared throughout Michigan for Detroit. And then it came down to saying, let's be very methodical. It wasn't about just pulling the bankruptcy cord. We went through a whole process, Kevin and I, a lot of us for 2 or 3 years working through it, starting in 2011 as soon as I got sworn in. And ultimately it became clear bankruptcy was what needed to happen. And on that day, I remember I did a press conference. And the quote, I do remember what I said, is I said, hopefully in the history of Detroit, this will be the lowest day in its history. Because that meant what we're doing by declaring bankruptcy worked. That every day after was going to be a better day, or eventually get to better days. And if the bankruptcy didn't work, Detroit was going to continue to go downhill. So there was a lot at stake. These were not easy decisions or easy work to do, but it was the right thing to do. And ultimately, Kevin taught me this, and I learned a lot from the judge and Judge Rosen later, but Kevin taught me this. Chapter 9 was never about money. It was about better services to citizens. And that's fundamentally what the citizens of Detroit deserved. Every Michigander deserves a certain level of service. And as governor of Michigan, I was going to do whatever I can within my power to help the citizens of Detroit be great citizens of Michigan and have a better life.
Coming from the political party that was not the majority in the city of Detroit, how much resistance did you get to not take this step, especially as a sitting politician?
Well, you know my motto of relentless positive action, so I can't fully share how I would describe that in terms of views. As I mentioned, I campaigned in Detroit doing all that. I think I might have more fingers up than votes I got in the city. But that didn't matter. It was to do the right thing by the citizens. But I'll tell you a quick story. I did a town hall at WC3. And it was Bankolay Thompson and Mildred Gaddis were the people asking me questions.
Okay, I know them well.
And I actually said I had to go to the restroom before I got on stage. So to put it in perspective about how scary it kind of was, it took 6 officers to walk me to the bathroom. I thought I was like a 6-year-old kid. I had like 2 state troopers, 2 sheriff's deputies, WC3 security. I had all these officers to walk me down the hall. I thought I was, that 4-year-old kid being taken to the bathroom. That's how the environment was.
The selection of Kevin Orr as emergency manager, how did you make that decision? And before you answer the immediate question, because so much in life is about relationships, where did this relationship begin? I understand it goes all the way back to a snowball fight at
It
the
does.
University of Michigan.
Actually, we didn't really meet then, but that was the connection. That's why I did pick him to be emergency manager. So,
did you lose the snowball fight?
South Quad won.
Okay.
so the classic case is Kevin and I were contemporaries, both undergrad and law school. He was the year behind me in law school, but we were at U of M the whole time, and he was in South Quad, I was in West Quad, and there was an annual snowball fight. That's the largest snowball fight you'd ever find. You're talking probably 1,000 plus participants in this, and we would have been on opposite sides. And I learned to respect him from that snowball fight. No. It was really a case, though, we had so much in common ground and values. And I could see he was a person that cared. This was to be something that was unique, a unique opportunity to help people in a context that very few people in their lives get an opportunity to do. But it was a huge commitment. He was it was going to consume his life. For a time period at that point, it could have gone on for years, but for a lot of the wonderful people that are on these panels and we're hearing from today. But he was up for it, and I was happy to support him. And the way I described it is Kevin did the yeoman's work during the bankruptcy from our perspective of managing all this. My main position was to have his back and to make sure he knew he had the full support of the state of Michigan behind him.
Quick question before I transition to former emergency manager Kevin Orr. Your wife, Sue Snyder, played a role in this, sort of behind the scenes. What advice did she give you when you were contemplating this in the executive office or at home?
Well, I mean, Sue's wonderful, everybody that knows her. She's not wishy-washy in her views, and she made it clear, it's like, if you believe this, we're all with you, and you need to follow your conscience, and you need to move forward, and you need to do this. And that gives you great comfort, because a lot of people question the decisions I made through this entire process. When I was making them, there were a lot more people that didn't support what I was doing versus support what I was doing. But you have to do the right thing, and the message that Sue always brought me back to, that I always came back to, is the citizens of Detroit are real people. It's not about Detroit, it's about the citizens and their lives. And I walked the streets of Detroit, I did things, and there were conditions people should not live in. And something needed to happen. And God knows, I was going to do something while I was on my watch.
Kevin Orr, welcome back to Detroit.
Thank you.
I trust you didn't need security this time coming back.
I didn't.
A few years ago, you might have needed a little more security. I recall you coming to the station with maybe a little security. Right. As you reflect back, why did you accept the emergency manager's role, particularly as an African-American lawyer, or a lawyer who happened to be African-American, obviously well-trained, in a city that at that time still is predominantly African-American?
82%?
I imagine there are a lot of lawyers, regardless of how trained they were, that said, no way in hell.
Mm-hmm. Chuck, great question, and there were 3 reasons, really. First and foremost, people didn't realize it, but I had been working in Detroit. The Chrysler bankruptcy, Stellantis, was one of the cases that we'd handled. I went to school here, so I had a great affinity. Detroit was our big date city when I was in undergrad and also in law school. And also in that same answer to the first question, I'm solution-oriented. During the balance sheet and structural analysis of Detroit, if you put private sector principles into a municipal environment, it was not cash flowing. And the cash flow here was service delivery, as Judge Rhodes had mentioned, service delivery and solvency. we went through all the statistics about how long it took for a police car to get there over the national average, which is 12 to 13. It was 40 minutes. An EMT was over 40 minutes, which meant that there was an 80% mortality rate in the city at the time. So you don't get there in the first 40, the brain dies and people are going to die. Housing stock, 20% was blighted or subject of arson. 40% of our lights were out. I mean, I can go through all the statistics, but if I looked at this from my training in the private sector, it was an enterprise, a municipal enterprise, but an enterprise nonetheless, airline, cruise company, whatever, needing resolution. Number two was my family always told me to never run from a challenge, that I stand on the shoulders of mighty people, particularly as an African American, whether it's Crispus Attucks, who died 5 years before shots at Concord in Lexington was fought in 1770, whether it was the African American troops that fought at Lexington and Concord, whether it was the Doughboys who came back in 1918 in part, that's the reason there was Tulsa, was they were demanding their rights, whether it was the 761st Tank Battalion or the Tuskegee Airmen. My uncle was a member of that troop going to Tuskegee, fought in World War II. You never run from a challenge, irrespective of what the issues are. I stand on the shoulders of those people who fought those challenges and did not benefit from their patriotism during the course of lifetimes, including my father, who was an Army officer who had his first son in Heidelberg, Germany, an integrated officers ward. I was born in a segregated clinic in Broward County, Florida, because they would not admit my mother into Broward General Hospital after her water broke. They told her, "Negress, you can't have that baby here." So I was well aware of the schism that can often occur, but nonetheless, it was a challenge. And third really was three ways. I believed in the governor and his commitment after I met with him, that it was sincere. You have to have leadership that's willing to undertake a challenge and own it to be successful, whether it's a board of directors or a CEO. He was CEO of the state under the 1973 state constitution. I believed in my managing partner, then Steve Brogan, who after we had come back the next day, I said, I don't want to do it. I'm fairly well ensconced in my role as a corporate law firm partner with my silk stockings and whatnot. Why would I fall away from that? Fairly handsome compensation. And he said, well, I don't think your dad, raised you to run from a challenge. And you're an African-American restructuring professional in a city from which our firm had a long relationship since 1893 that needs your assistance. And probably the most important was my wife, who after I went home and told her, you're not going to believe what my white Scotch-Irish partner told me about my duty to my people. And she said, he's right. She said, every day you're running around here, remonstrating at the TV and the talking heads on Sunday morning about somebody needs to be involved. And either you step up to the challenge or I don't have to listen to you anymore. And she asked me something. All marriages are not just the sacrament of marriage, they're a partnership. And sometimes one of the partners is tougher than the other one. And she's a physician. She has a practice that will be fine. We had young children who were at that point 3 and 5. And she said, I want you to pursue this obligation because you owe it to the people. She asked me one important question, though. She says, do you trust the governor? And I said, yes, I do. I think he's sincere. She said, then if you trust the principle of what she's learned from law, then it's the right thing for you to do.
You said it wasn't politics, it was just math.
It's just math. It's just math.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was it just math in your point of view? Because it was started in the spring, not the whole bankruptcy, but the process by a sitting elected official.
The math part was easy. In fact, as the governor mentioned, the process started back in 2010. You had Detroit review teams that were publishing reports of facts, just facts. You're entitled, was it Mark Twain? You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Facts are facts. And when you looked at the facts of all those statistics, but also the cash flow analysis and the projections, there was only one solution. I mean, you were going to go from 20% of the general fund billion-dollar budget to 73% of the budget doing legacy costs, antecedent debt, in the language that Judge Rhodes and I use. This year, 2020, that means $1 billion, $730 million was going to be the numerator, $1 billion was going to be the denominator, was going to go for past due debt. You couldn't run a city that way. So the math was the easy part. What I had to learn was the civic, emotional, and relationship, as well as, quite frankly, the racial dynamic in the city. You know, Wayne County, African American, Lansing, was it sincere? Are they trying to take us out? And learn how to parse through that. But when I said it's math, it's just math. If you put things down on a balance sheet, and you know, Governor Snyder at core is a lawyer and an accountant. Look at the balance sheet. There's only one solution based upon the facts, but parsing that through to the impact to people, which were very passionate about their city and very passionate about the risk and very passionate about this museum. You know, I had people in the city who wanted to get mad at me, and I had soccer moms up in, you know, Oakland County who wanted to have a piece too, because they feared that I was going to destroy this great legacy for not just Michigan, but for the world. This museum has been ranked as #1 museum in the United States of America in the past 2 years.
True.
That's outstanding. I'll tell you, we had our partnership committee and advisory committee meeting here, 100 of my partners from around the world. We have 40 offices around the world in 16 different cities, including Paris. Our office on Place de Concorde at the old Hotel Talleyrand in Paris. And so they're just down the street from the Louvre, and they came to the city, and they were stunned at how beautiful it was and how impressive the museum was. They're still sending me messages about how great it was to go to Detroit and how proud they are at how the city has thrived.
Quick question before I transition to Judge Rhodes. Were you really prepared to sell the art in this building that you're sitting in tonight, or was that just a good poker bluff?
Both. It was both. On the one hand, as a receiver, which is essentially what I was, I have a fiduciary and an obligation to assess all the value of the assets of the enterprise. We brought in Christie's to value it, and we wanted that done by August. I know Judge Rhodes felt very strongly that that was not going to happen on his watch. But my view was I have to at least provide value and extract some value for that asset. Otherwise, I'm not discharging my fiduciary duty as a receiver. So was I willing? This museum has 60,000 pieces of art. How could I say to predominantly diverse retirees with an average pension of $19,200 at the time that I may have to adversely impact your relatively modest pension, but I'm not going to touch any of the crown jewels of the city? That would not have been a fair resolution. I hoped against hope that it would never happen, and you have no idea how relieved I was when it did not. But if I were going to discharge my duty, I had to go through that process.
All right, you bluffed everyone pretty good. Judge Rhodes, you write in Judge Rosen's book, you say, I was honored to serve in this role. Yet you were thinking about retirement and in the process of doing so. Why in the world were you honored to do that when you could have sat home and not dealt with this headache?
Well, I knew going into this process that time was the enemy, that the case would have to be resolved as promptly as possible. As the governor pointed out, people were suffering because of the lack of service, municipal services in the city. And I felt that I was able to provide that strong judicial management that this case would need. I'd been on the bench at that time for 28 years, and I knew how to move cases. And I also knew that it would take strong mediation management too. I knew it would take both. And that's why I imposed upon Judge Rosen to be the chief mediator in the case.
You felt he was the right person?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, there's a guy who loves the city of Detroit and who has the position in our city, had the position in our city to command respect and to be in charge of a process that was not going to be an easy process, and it wasn't. So it was an honor to be able to help the people of the city of Detroit.
Your wife also played a role in this, right? What was it?
Well, of course, she was very supportive of me. There were times when decisions that I had to make in the case were very hard to make. Not so much legally, but emotionally. And so when that happened, as for example, when I had to find that the bankruptcy code preempted the Michigan Constitution and allowed me and the emergency manager to impair pension claims, that was easy to do legally, but very hard to do emotionally. I didn't like having to do that. And she was very supportive and understanding of that. There were tough times, and I was very happy to have a partner help me through that.
One of your goals was to get this done in a year. How many people thought you were crazy?
Probably everyone except Judge Rosen. He and I hatched that plan together. We sketched it all out, and we came close. We were only a couple of months off, but we shared the view that time was the enemy. We had to get this done.
Was that partly because you wanted to get back to retirement?
Partly, yeah.
Just kidding with you. You've also said in the book, there was too much democracy.
No, I did not say that. Rosen said that. I had been living
Sounds like
with...
a judge blaming a judge. Okay,
Yeah,
let's go.
I had been living with this concept of democracy in Chapter 11 cases throughout my career as a bankruptcy judge. I knew how it worked. I knew the importance of it. I knew the role that it played. And it carries into Chapter 9, which is the chapter that deals with municipal bankruptcies. And I was not unhappy with it. I knew the role that it played. But when I told Jerry about this concept of democracy in a judicial case, he was aghast because he was not accustomed to dealing with democracy in his courtroom. No.
Two quick questions. I know we're running just a tad over time, but I know in the next panel, Judge Rosen, who's very brief always with his comments, will make the time up, right? You say in the book, all politicians should read this book. Why?
So I'd like to begin my answer to that question by thanking Judge Rosen for writing this book. It's not just interesting and entertaining, as you pointed out. It is an important book. It is an important book because it lays out a path, a roadway by which very difficult societal issues can be resolved. So politicians should read this book to see how to go about solving these sometimes incorrigible problems. And so that's why it's an important book.
How many years before the bankruptcy was actually started and done should it have been done?
At least 8, if not 10 years. There were a series of transactions in the 2005 timeframe that seemed like a good idea to some people at the time, but which were a disaster for the city and ultimately was the straw that broke the camel's back. And so, yeah, it should have been at least 8, if not more years before that.
And does that buttress why you say politicians should read this book?
It certainly, absolutely.
Final question. We've heard Kevin Orr talk about the art that he was prepared to sell, bluffing to sell, whichever one you want to believe. Were you ever going to let that happen?
No. And the reason is not just because it is the jewel of the city and it is beloved, not just for that reason, but for a bankruptcy reason as well. My view was that the sale of the assets, which would produce a significant amount of money, wouldn't solve the city's problems. It would delay them. It would create a pot of money to fund the pension plans for a period of time, but only for a period of time. It would be another act of kicking the can down the road, and Detroit had to stop kicking the can down the road.
All right. Governor Snyder, Judge Rhodes, Attorney Kevin Orr, thank you so much.
Thank
We're now going to move on to our second panel, and they're going to reset the stage just a little bit. You're going to watch a video. We're going to step off. Don't leave. We'll be back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you all.
Distinguished guests, please enjoy this brief video presentation from the Kresge Foundation.
A place that plants strong seeds, shapes and defines its future without fear. There is a rush, an urgency blooming in the heart of our city. A wild seed, disguised as a paintbrush, a keyboard, or a film camera, planted in our rich Midwest clay, now thriving, expanding its reach far beyond the surface. We are the beneficiaries, artists who collage, stain glass, and sow community, build and imagine and dream far beyond expectation. The brick and mortar strength of Marygrove, the pride and growth toward the east, alive on Jefferson and Chalmers. From Bagley to Southwest, we barbers, runners along an international riverfront. Poetry in our drive, our walk, our black bottom stories. This is salt work, life work, passed down gift. It's in the undertow. It's in the sowing inside the earth so the new crop flourishes. It's a respect for culture and a call to action. We recognize trailblazers and push them into the beautiful new. Welcome to our centennial. We're just getting started. As we honor Gilda Snowden, united we stand proudly in the Amazon shadow of Charles McGee, a concert of colors, a parade of Deshaun Jones and Chris Johnson notes. We are a bustling people's food co-op, tech town and necessary block clubs, sidewalk festivals and new community hubs. Ideas transforming highways, our art district, the right, the DIA, our libraries, the new center and avenue of fashion, the way we eat together, the way we generate love, and pass down our canvas complex stories to the next generation. What a rich soil we water. Our youth, our elders, our legends, our millennials, our creators, with heavy roots. Ha, wild seeds, as vast as the stars. Welcome to our centennial. We're just getting started.
Please welcome Chairman Emeritus of the Detroit Institute of Arts, Jean Gargaro. President and Chief Executive Officer of the Kresge Foundation, Rip Rapson. Retired Judge of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, the Honorable Victoria A. Roberts. Retired Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, the Honorable Gerald E. Rosen. And to moderate the discussion, Chuck Stokes.
Please have a seat. How's everybody?
Good.
Glad this day got here, aren't you? We've had a few conferences on the phone for a little bit, so I think everybody's like, phew, we're here. Let me mention to the audience that, sorry, I just hit my mic. I know that probably just drove the audio person crazy. Rip and Judge Rosen will be part of this panel discussion, but also part of the next panel discussion. So they get a little double duty here. So I'm going to start with Judge Roberts, Victoria Roberts, and then I'll go to Jean Gargaro, and then to Mr. Rapson and Judge Rosen. Judge Roberts, you had an unenviable task to deal with trying to herd all the cows into this thing. You had the responsibility of mediating 48, I'll repeat, 48 collective bargains, all of which expired and the city had imposed employment terms. What was the greatest challenge you faced in reaching that? And were you actually sane when you took that up?
I don't know that I was sane when I finished, but I had a sane moment when I said yes. There were several challenges, Chuck. I think the first one was a challenge of mistrust and distrust. And I think it began even before I started the bargaining process. It began when the city challenged whether I could be neutral enough to bargain on its behalf as well as on behalf of the unions. And they challenged that because of my background. I was born in Detroit. I am from a union family. My parents migrated from the South, as many blacks did in the 40s. My father ended up at Great Lakes Steel and put 35 years in at Zug Island as a machine repairman and was a member of the United Steel Workers. My mom, when she entered the workforce, became a merchandise checker at the old J.L. Hudson's company, and she worked at the warehouse on Warren Avenue. And all of you shoppers who have those little merchandise tags hanging from your clothes, that's what my mom did. And in doing that, she was a member of the Teamsters, a very proud member of the Teamsters. And so my family was a union family, and we endured strikes. And so I knew what people who were part of union families went through. The city dropped its challenge that I couldn't be neutral. I had been on the bench for a number of years by then. And so that was the first indication of any kind of mistrust or distrust. And then I saw it immediately when we began the negotiations. The union people certainly distrusted the city. They didn't believe that it was out of money. They distrusted the city because the conditions of employment had been imposed and wages had been cut and health care had been cut. And there was the threat of privatizing a lot of city services and people would lose their jobs. So there was that anger, there was that mistrust. And then on the part of the city really did believe that the union contracts had contributed to the plight of the city, that it was saddled with a lot of pension and health care costs for retirees, and they were one of the creditors in the bankruptcy. So there was anger about those issues. The city, another challenge was that the city really was out of money. It really, truly was. There's no money in a shoebox up in someone's ceiling. And another challenge, I think, was just the legal challenges. Judge Rhodes spoke a little bit about that. And the union people, the retirees, the other creditors, they were all part of a very broad coalition that believed that that statute was unconstitutional and believed that the bankruptcy was unconstitutional. And so we had that coalition of people with very divergent interests who were challenging the bankruptcy. And so going into that room was, it felt like I was going into enemy territory. And when we began the bankruptcy, there were a lot of people in the room. Some of the days there may have been 30 people in the room on opposite sides of the table representing the interest of the unions, representing the city interest. And for a while, I thought that all of this was wasted time, that we weren't getting anywhere. But I came to believe that it wasn't wasted time at all, and having done a lot of other mediations, it's clear that people have to get rid of the emotion. They have to get rid of the frustration because it's going to stand in the way of being able to reach a bargain. So while there was a lot of shouting across the table, it was the release of emotion that stood in the way. And during that time, I could see who was going to emerge as the leaders and who would be able to help me and who needed to go out of the room.
Judge, were there a couple key lessons learned from this mediation that should benefit and are good lessons for the future, not dealing with this bankruptcy, but for things that may come down the horizon?
Certainly, Chuck. I think that I just started to talk a little bit about it. I think that people go into people need to understand that litigation, especially in this situation and in so many others, is just not the way to resolve disputes. If this case had gone the way of litigation, if Judge Rhodes' ruling had been appealed and we had been tied up in court for years and years, the city certainly would not have had the result that we had. So we did build coalitions. I could see that these friendships and relationships were building across the table, and they benefited us when we were trying to get to an agreement. There were many discussions that happened during the negotiations that didn't even include me, because people had begun to build these relationships and knew who in their organizations, who in their groups they had to touch in order to get an agreement. And I think another point is that people just had to understand that the settlement did not mean that we were collapsing, and that in the end it could be a win and not a win and a lose.
What did the city give up and what did the unions give up? And did they make the biggest sacrifice in this?
The unions? Well, Governor Snyder said that it really wasn't about the money. But for people in the union and for the pensioners, it really was about the money. Something that was said often during the course of the mediation when there was discussion about preserving the art. The union people thought that it was that they would be the sacrificial lambs in that. And it really was about the money. They said, we can't eat art. We have to feed our families. So that was something that did happen and that had to happen, I think, in order for us to get to a conclusion. But the human element was very real for people in the union and for the pensioners, because they could not eat art.
Thank you, Judge. I know there's a lot more. You have to read the book to get a lot more of the details, but it gives you a good primer. Jean Gargaro, talk to us about this most expensive breakfast in history. And exactly how much was it?
Well, Chuck, the breakfast itself took place in late January of 2014, but all during the fall of 2013, as many of our guests remember, the headlines in the paper were, "The DIA is silent, doesn't want to participate." The environment was very contentious. And
was it true?
No, we did that by design. I wanted to see where everybody was lining up before we started offering to be at the table. And I had the benefit of Judge Rosen and Eugene Dreiker, who started, I think, in October of that year, calling and telling me generally about what Rip Rabson and the wonderful foundation community were planning, and that the DIA had to have some skin in this game. Well, you might remember, just before that time, we passed a historic millage among Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb County. We were raising $8 to $10 million a year, beginning in January of every year, just to keep the lights on in the museum. So I didn't have a lot of discretionary reserves on hand, and our board was very thoughtful and wanted to participate. So Rick Snyder at some point calls and tells me what he's doing, trying to get all 83 counties in Michigan to the table, and would I be his guest at a breakfast in Washington, D.C. He was going to receive an arts award from the National Mayor's Conference. So I quickly assembled our executive committee, and I said, I think the writing on the wall is we better have some participation in this wonderful effort. Kevin Orr mentioned leadership. It was all about leadership. So I traveled to Washington. Rick got his his mayor's award. I was waiting just for the time when we might separate from the group because I was able to have the board at the museum authorize $50 million to participate in this wonderful framework. At the time, I had no idea where we were going to raise $50 million. But I thought that number would be sufficient to get me, in the group. So after the breakfast, Rick pulled me aside and he said, "Gene, I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes." And I thought, oh boy, is he going to be excited to hear about my $50 million. So he starts to lay out the framework that I had heard, and I think I might have interrupted him to say, "Rick, thank you for that background, but I've got some wonderful news for you. I'm here with the authority of the board at the Detroit Institute of Arts to pledge $50 million. And I hope that's helpful to the cause." I remember he, without any hesitation, he said, "Gene, that's going to be a very difficult stretch to raise that money. I respect that." But he said, "I need $100 million." So, as I recall, I could have said, I need to go back to Detroit and bring the group together and talk about this. I thought, though, this was a very singular moment. Here's the governor of the state of Michigan. The museum community had already lined up. This is something we need to do. So I reached across the table and I said, "Governor, if I didn't know where the 50 was coming from, I certainly don't know where the 100's coming from." But I said, "We're in, and I'm going to go back and make this a unanimous decision of our board."
How long did it take you to raise it?
9 months.
And you were in the midst of an endowment campaign for the DIA too.
Well, and we were coming out of the financial crisis in our city. General Motors and Chrysler, we used to be able to go to those wonderful corporations, no problem. This was a whole different fundraising environment, Chuck. There's a gentleman here tonight who you've met, Paul Skopp, and his wife Carol, were the very first people to call Judge Rosen, and they started this with $5 million. After that, we didn't have a fancy brochure when we went out to raise this money. There were three things: help Detroit exit from bankruptcy, help the pensioners retain their pensions, and save the Detroit Institute of Arts. Very rarely did I receive a no. The first response most of the time was, "How long do we have to pay?" As a fundraiser, when you hear that opening comment, you're in the red zone. How you get the ball into the end zone is up to you. But it was an amazing experience to see money started coming in from all over the world. Checks for $100, $10. Another prominent Detroit businessman and IndyCar racing champ said to me, "Gene, I'm not an art guy, but in order to have a great city, you need arts and culture. Sign me up for $10 million. I mean, those kinds of things really
The snowball has started. Very quickly, because time's our worst enemy, as it is on mine on Sunday mornings. Miriam Nolan, now retired, but goes back such a long way with the Community Foundation and founding executive director of it. There was a meeting that you had with her and I believe Judge Rosen. Tell us briefly about that meeting and the role it played.
Well, she talk about leadership when this history, and it is now written thanks to Jerry, very modest to a fault, but I watched Miriam carefully. She was always very thoughtful, had great judgment. Really, there was very little mystery about where we needed to be, talking to the judge and Miriam about the role that the Detroit Institute of Arts needed to have in this wonderful historic story. So after we met, it further helped me bring our board together to validate the $100 million pledge we made.
Very good, thank you. Judge, last time I checked your resume, you went to law school, I believe, at George Washington University, and you spent your entire career in the legal business. Tell us about this doodle that has become art and is now sitting here in the DIA. When did you become an artist?
Well, there were no classes in law school on raising $820 million to help rescue a city, and certainly no classes in law school about being a mediator. But the doodle came about really as a brainstorm that I had early one morning at the very beginning of the bankruptcy. I tend to try to conceptualize ideas, and I woke up at about 5:30, and I had been taking notes in conversations I'd been having with lawyers, and in front of me was the cardboard backing of a legal pad. And I was very focused on trying to figure out how to leverage the art without selling it, liquidating it, because in truth it was the only asset that the city had, Chuck. And yet there was not going to be a solution to the bankruptcy without finding a way to monetize the art. The creditors all wanted to, in some more strongly than others, but the creditors all wanted to monetize the art. It's a sanitary term, but they wanted to sell it. One creditor even thought of coming in and carving up the Diego Rivera murals, and all of you will see that. And they had appraised the murals and figured out a way to carve them up and sell them. So it was very real, and my good friend and negotiating partner, Kevin Orr, had hired Christie's to appraise the art. So it was very real, and it had to be, as Kevin talked about, because it was the only real asset the city had. On the other hand, there were the retirees, whose plight was desperate, and between their health care needs and their pensions, they were the largest single creditor group. Their pension was underfunded by $3.5 billion, and their health care by almost $6 billion. So I had this idea of, in my mind, they were the bookends. The art and the retirees were the bookends. So I woke up with this idea. I'd been talking to the lawyers and thinking about it, and I just did this doodle that became the Grand Bargain, which was really a three-legged stool. The first stool was the state. My first conversations with my friend Rick Snyder didn't yield any productive fruit. He was very nice, relentless positive action, but his first answer was no money. His staff was much more direct, as in, what part of no don't you understand? Because I didn't.
Were there a few swear words in there too?
I didn't stop, but the first part was to get the state to kickstart the funding, and then the idea was to take the art, put it in a trust, and use that to flow money through and give it to the retirees to mitigate their pension losses. So the three legs were the state, the art, and the retirees. And then we had to raise the money. And when I couldn't persuade the governor initially, I ran into Miriam Nolan in the deli across the street from the courthouse. And she asked me how things were going, and I said, not so great. But I have an idea. And she came over, and thank goodness she got her friends from the foundations together, including my old friend, Rip Rapson, from 50 years before in Washington, D.C. And that was really the second leg, the foundations. We had a meeting on November 5th of 2013. We got them all together with Miriam's help, and they began to consider this sort of out-of-the-blue proposition of helping to raise money. And the third leg of the stool was, so we had the state, we had the foundations, and the third leg was my friend Gene Gargaro at the DIA, because everybody was saying to us, if the DIA is going to get its independence from the city's creditors, the DIA had to have some skin in the game. And Gene told the story exactly correctly, with one friendly amendment. You don't know this, Gene, but the night before, Governor Snyder called me. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and he said he'd been spending a couple hours with the DIA's audited financials. He's an accountant. And he said he can see how to save the DIA $5 to $6 million a year. So I said, great, Rick, what are you going to do with that? He was, as Gene said, he was going to Washington to get an award from the Americans for Art. And I said, what are you going to do with that, Rick? And he said, I'm going to ask Gene for $100 million tomorrow. I said, Rick, get the award first. But that was the third leg. And you know, when I first did the doodle, Chuck, I was still down in Florida, and I put it in a stack of stuff and took it back with me and forgot about the doodle. I didn't forget about the idea, the grand bargain idea, what became the grand bargain idea. But I forgot about the doodle until several months later. Gene was coming in for lunch, and I just happened to be in my office going through the stacks trying to clear a path to my desk, and I found this doodle on this cardboard backing, put it on my desk, and when Gene came in, I showed it to him, and I said, you won't believe what this is. He knew exactly what it was, and he said, that's got to hang in the DIA. So it's hanging here now, and I'll just say that my grandmother was a renowned artist, very successful.
So the genes work.
Yeah, well, I don't know about the genes, but she was always very gentle with me about my artistic abilities, and she'd be shocked to know that I had a piece of art in a major museum. But I'm going to add one more thing, and Pat Gene and his colleagues, Salvador, and the rest of the folks here. Last year and this year, the DIA was voted the #1 art museum in the United States. It would have been a travesty to lose it. You know, Detroit had been cannibalizing its heritage to mortgage its future for decades, and this would have just been the exclamation point on Detroit's obituary, I thought. So I agreed with Steve. No way were we going to sell the art.
20 seconds. Tell me where the term the grand bargain come up from.
John Gallagher, who's, I think, here tonight. John was a Free Press reporter. He was chasing the story of the meeting that we had with the foundations, and I was spooling it out for him, telling him what it was, and he said, so that's kind of like a grand bargain. And, you know, the President Obama and Speaker Boehner had just had a grand bargain that had collapsed in recriminations, and I said, well, I hope this one does better than the last one, and John said, I think it will. And it took off. The next day, John published the story. The lead on it was Judge Rosen is working on a grand bargain, and I received an email out of the blue from somebody I'd never heard of, Paul Scott, and he said he was inspired by, he just showed me tonight the original email. He was inspired by the idea of the grand bargain, and he wanted to commit $5 million. I thought maybe it was one of these emails from, you know, from offshore, but he wasn't asking for my bank account. So I referred to Paul, and there's a chapter in the book called A Virtual Walk-In, because he was my virtual walk-in.
Very good. Rip Rasmussen, you've been sitting here patiently. Thank you. You're going to be back in the next segment as well. But give us a nice tease here so we can get into the next segment. Quick overview. When you heard that the foundations would be needed for this.
Talk about expensive meals. Judge Rosen and Lori asked Gail and me to dinner, and I'd known Jerry forever, as he mentioned. And he said, well, I've got this idea. And I said, oh, good, great. And he laid it out, and he said, I'm going to call it the Art Trust. And I said, really? You're going to call it the Art Trust? And he said, yeah, because we've got to develop this pass-through that preserves the art and creates creates the basis for settlement of the bankruptcy. So I said, well, that's nice. And so how much are you looking for? And he said, oh, I don't know. It seems reasonable, $600 to $800 million. And I said, oh, okay. It was kind of like your moment, Gene. And I said, okay, but I guess two things. One, I think you should find another name for it, because the whole point of the bargain was to ensure the consensual and early exit from bankruptcy. It wasn't per se to save the art, and it wasn't per se to save the pensions. It had to be to get the city out of bankruptcy, because as Victoria said, otherwise you're in bankruptcy in one way or another for 10 years. I mean, you're just litigating constitutionality of primacy of law, you're litigating the public trust of the art, and so but the second piece was, I think, a little bit more complicated, is that for foundations, $3 or $4 or $5 or $600 million is a real number. And what was hard was that after that very first meeting, there was dead silence out of the foundation community. There was no motion. And there were a lot of dropaways, and we don't talk much about that, but there are a lot of people who were not prepared to come to the table. It was just too audacious, too big, and too out of their zone. And so I think one of the things that is part of a longer story is that the musculature that the foundation community had developed for cooperation in the years leading up to the bankruptcy was really quite extraordinary. We had worked on the rail project, we had worked to build a more vibrant arts economy, we had worked to build a small business fund. I mean, we had done a lot of stuff, Ford and Kellogg and Hudson Weber and others. And so when it came to trying to figure out whether we could come back to the table after your first meeting, there was enough muscle memory of what it looked like to cooperate so that we did. And so when nothing happened for 2 or 3 weeks, we called a meeting at Kresge and asked people to come and get serious. Say, you know, it's all fine to hear out the judge, but at some point we've got to come to the table. And one of the unsung heroes in all of this, because there was still crickets at that table, we couldn't get people to kind of step in, was a guy named Bill White, who ran the Mott Foundation. He was on the phone. Everyone was kind of sitting on their hands, and Bill said, look, this is crazy. We're not even from Detroit, and I'll start the bidding at $10 million. And that sort of opened the floodgates. And from there, everyone sort of got back into the game, and Ford committed 125, and we committed 125, and Davidson came in at 25. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary.
And Kresge committed $100 million.
Right. And so yeah. But I think, and then I'll stop, Chuck. I think it's a reminder of the power of relationships that was talked about earlier. We had developed a way of working together. We trusted one another. We certainly trusted the judge, and we certainly trusted the DIA, that they would ultimately come to the table. But I think ultimately we had to trust one another, because for all of us, those were big commitments, and commitments on top of our spend. We were very clear that we weren't going to reduce our spending in Detroit by $1, even though we were going to put another $100 million on the table. And all around the table, that was the same message. And I think that came out of a sort of a concerted, long-term relationship building effort that had preceded the bankruptcy.
Panelists, thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next panel. We're going to show a little video first while we reset the stage, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the rebirth of the city of Detroit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
Distinguished guests, please enjoy a brief video presentation from the Mayor of the City of Detroit, Mike Duggan.
An interesting thing happened. People started inviting me into their homes. And in 2013, it was a depressing time. Tens of thousands of people had cleared out the city, left their houses behind. And as I went into these living rooms, that's what I thought I was going to find. But you know what I found? the people who invited me were the ones who were going to stick and stay. They wanted to have a future. They told me about their past, their family's history, their aspirations. Many of these nights went on for hours, and the thing they would say is, our neighbor has been forgotten. That's what I'd hear every night, 250 times. I'd say, what do you mean by that? I'd say, well, look out there. There's illegal dumping. Nobody's picked it up. There's open abandoned houses. Nobody cares. You dial 911. The police don't show up. The ambulance doesn't show up. The alleys have been filled for a decade, and the street lights don't work. And it didn't matter whether it went far east side, west side, southwest. They said, we've been forgotten. I could go to Sherwood Forest or East English Village or Rosedale, and they said, our neighbor has been forgotten. And I realized in the course of that, what they were really saying is, our city's been forgotten. And it hurt, and it was forgotten. After what Detroit did for the world in World War II, what we did to build the middle class, when things started to go south, the manufacturing industry left, the business community left, Lansing turned their back on us, Washington turned their back on us, it seemed like the country forgot about us, and that maybe hurt the most. And so I think about that day, those days when this much younger version of me sat in those rooms 10 years ago, and I think, for all of you who thought America forgot about us, they haven't forgotten about us anymore. 300,000 visitors, 50 million people watching on TV. We got a chance to introduce ourselves again to America. And when we do, we hope to be just like the Lions and introduce America to a very different Detroit than they expected. Because the last time we were in the national spotlight, MSNBC had us on, it was about bankruptcy. And a lot of people, that's still their image. But when they get here, they're going to see a very different city. On the east side, they're going to see a new Jeep plant employing thousands of Detroiters that wasn't here the last time they were here. What used to be called the Poletown plant has now been reinvented at Factory Zero. They just added a second shift. They've got 4,000 employees building electric cars, twice as many as were building the old internal combustion engine cars in the same plant. Thank you, General Motors. State Fairgrounds, abandoned since 2011. Transformed as a major employment and transit center. 1,200 employees just at Amazon, most of them Detroiters. On West Grand Boulevard, they'll find the new Henry Ford Cancer Institute, which was just a start to the new $3 billion hospital development, one of the finest that's going to be in the Midwest. This is what they'll find. The Hudson's property, abandoned for 40 years, now home to the second tallest building in Michigan, and when it's finished next year, it's going to become the new GM World Headquarters. The new high-rise is reshaping Detroit's skyline. The Torgo family already built the Huntington Bank headquarters in Water Square, and with yesterday's City Council approval, a new convention hotel is going up that's going to bring in even more visitors to our city. So, 10 years ago, people came to Detroit on ruined porn tours. You're in the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. Detroit's the world capital of staring at abandoned buildings. Well, when they come back to stare at this abandoned building, they're going to find that it's a new 700-employee Lear seating plant. And the Book Tower, abandoned for 25 years, beautifully restored by Dan Gilbert. The United Artists Theater that closed in '83. Emmett Moten and a team of Detroiters are finishing up the rebuild of 150 apartments. The long-abandoned Eddystone has already been rebuilt by Chris Illich into beautiful apartments. The AMC headquarters was a must-see stop on the ruined porn tour. When they get there today, it's a new GM parts facility. Of course, everybody wanted to see Fisher 21. I went through it the other day, and I think everybody in town visited and spray painted on one of those floors. It's now being renovated by Greg Jackson and Richard Hosey into 435 new apartments. And of course, they'll want to see the abandoned Packer plant that stopped making cars in 1956. But more than 60 years later, it's now being demolished, and we're saving the front as part of an historic site, but it will be a new auto manufacturing site. They won't even be able to look at the Packer plant anymore. So this year, when they show up, we're officially declaring Detroit's ruined porn tours canceled. Instead of blight, they can visit beauty, like they have on the new Riverside Park. DTE took this eyesore on Grand River and built Beacon Park. Our industrial riverfront, as you all know, is now rated by USA Today the finest river walk in America. That's what they're going to find. And our visitors are going to find another dramatic change. Our financial condition. All the national stories, debt, bankruptcy, and the like, they didn't pay attention for us for a while. But last month, Detroit returned to investment grade status for the first time since 2009. And the members of City Council had an awful lot to do with that.
Please welcome founder and chairman of Rocket Companies and co-founder of the Gilbert Family Foundation, Dan Gilbert. And joining Dan Gilbert, please welcome back Rip Rapson, Judge Rosen, and Chuck Stokes.
Thank you. Okay, I'm old enough to remember when Coleman Alexander Young said he wasn't going to seek re-election, and then when Dave Bing said he wasn't going to seek re-election, in the cast of 1,000 who decided to line up. So show me a show of hands, how many here are not going to be running for mayor? Just kidding with you. Dan Gilbert. I remember quite a few years ago now, I'm really dating myself here, coming down to your office. We made you our Channel 7 Newsmaker of the Year. That was before the grand bargain and any talk about the grand bargain and the bankruptcy. And I remember a board in your office with all sorts of things on it. And I remember somebody erasing some of it, probably so the media couldn't see it. And as we talked about it, you said something that I hadn't heard before. You said, I have a Big Bang theory. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about the Big Bang theory and coming out of the bankruptcy as we talk about the rebirth. What was your overall vision for the city of Detroit?
Well, the Big Bang Theory way back, you're talking probably now 15 years ago, which isn't that far back based on what I heard from you earlier. Mm-hmm. But I think that it was, do you do residential first? Do you do business first? Office first? What comes first? Restaurants? But if you really think about it, everything's dependent on each other. So if we were going to make the capital contribution and the human capital investment into what we were doing, we had to do it in a Big Bang Theory, everything at once. And when I say once, I don't mean in 1 month or 1 year, but maybe over a decade. And that's kind of what happened. And the vision going into after the bankruptcy was, well, first of all, let's go before the bankruptcy, because we got down here originally in 2010. And I'll tell you that the bankruptcy was looming even then over everybody's heads. But once the bankruptcy was filed, I thought it was going to be a disaster from what it meant for other companies out of town and investors. It actually turned out to be the opposite. I literally started getting calls the next day from companies and investors who were interested in Detroit. I guess they figured that was the bottom, and they figured now it's time to get in. So I think that the grand bargain and the bankruptcy cleared the decks. And you look at all the statistics that the mayor was talking about in the video, and there's more. I mean, things like crime being very, very low, unemployment being at a record low. As he mentioned, the city getting its investment grade on their financing, and there's more. All the interest in Detroit, the young people's interest. I mean, none of this happens without clearing the deck. And that's exactly what these gentlemen did here.
There used to be something in this town called Detroit Renaissance. Yes. And a lot of times things wouldn't happen until that room full of people sat down and the movers and shakers said, okay, this is what we're going to do. And you had a few senior members of that group, and if they weren't on board, not too much was going to happen. But they did a lot. Yeah. Your vision was a little different. Isn't it safe to say, did you find yourself, that's not going to work in this day and age. I've got a better plan, and I've got a different way I want to do it, and I think it's going to be better for this city.
Well, what we had employees, we had team members. I mean, we were out in the suburbs with thousands of people. So initially when we were coming to Detroit in these beautiful buildings we occupied, we didn't have to come in as a landlord and go find tenants. We were able to be the tenant and the landlord. So that was That was our version, I guess, of Detroit Renaissance. We had all the people that were working for us. And I got to tell you something, since day one we've been down here, they've all loved it. I mean, not one person has written a letter or said, I'm quitting, and I mean that. And that's out of like 10 or 12,000 people, which is almost impossible. So there's something about Detroit and the energy. It was even there back then, but now it's multiples of that. I mean, everybody knows it. Even when we recruit people from out of state, we won't recruit them on the phone or by Zoom. We need to get them here on the ground. And once their feet are on the ground walking around, they feel the energy of this place, and they want to be part of it.
Talk to me a little bit about the riverfront and what you see for the future. And used to be a thing in this town called Hudson's, which was beloved. I wasn't born and raised here, but my wife was. But I've been here since 1981. But she tells me the stories about going down there for Christmas, growing up in Russell Woods section of Detroit, and how beloved that building was. But I was here for when they imploded it. But you now have the Hudson's Tower going up. How's it coming, and how's that going to play into this rebirth?
Well, what you just mentioned about Hudson's, I think whether you're from the suburbs or whether you're from the city, everybody has those, if it's not their own memories, it's their parents' or even their grandparents' memories. I mean, I was about probably 5 or 7 or 8 years too young to have attended all that myself, but everybody who was older in my generation or the generation older always talked about, the whole Santa Claus thing and shopping there and it being one of the best department stores in the world. So we took our time. It's been 7 or 8 years since we put our shovel in the dirt, but we're getting ready. Next year, we're gonna have a grand opening. And as you probably know, General Motors has taken a anchor position in the office building. So there's the block building and then there's the tower. And we're very excited about it because it's not only gonna be office, it's gonna be retail on the grade level. We have a nice new hotel going in there in the tower. We have 90 condos. I got one with your name on it. That's 3 sales right there.
Well, Dan, I was going to put your picture on the front of the book, but I thought we could do just as well by having the Hudson's Tower on the front of the book.
I don't know. Take it. But.
Chuck, can I tell a Dan story?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So right in the middle of the bankruptcy kind of heating up, I get a call from Gene Sperling, President Obama's chief economic advisor, and he's cooking up a plan to try to figure out how to help Detroit. They can't forgive the bonds, they can't do any of that, but they can try to figure out how the federal government can help. So he asked if we could bring a bunch of people out and meet with Sperling. So Dan and I think it was Penske and a couple of other folks went out, and we walk into the West Conference Room, and there's the entire cabinet. And we sort of scroll through sort of the issues that we're all facing. And one of the things that I think blew everyone away was that Dan then said, not how can you help my commercial base, how can you help my investments downtown? He said, the problem we have in Detroit is all of the blight, the abandoned, vacant buildings. And the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development turned to him and said, all right, do you want to do something about that? And Dan said yes. And out of that came something called the Blight Task Force, that was centered in Quicken's sort of control rooms, and we went out and inventoried every property in the city of Detroit, fed it back into Quicken. They created this unbelievable database. I mention that because Dan personally oversaw that, and he personally committed to something that was not necessarily in his economic self-interest in any way. It was just an act of community building. And I think one of the reasons that Detroit has come back the way it was is that Dan Gilbert has consistently been first a civic booster and second a rock booster. He's been extraordinary.
Can I tell a Dan Gilbert story in the bankruptcy?
You guys know I am here, right?
Well, you're here.
Sure.
So when it came to the very last deal in the bankruptcy, it was a very difficult deal. We had one remaining creditor, recalcitrant creditor, Fidjic. They were the insurers of $1.1 billion in bonds. The only thing the city had left was the property under Joe Louis Arena and the property under the parking structure to the north. And they weren't buying it. So we got the idea that what we should do is get somebody to do a projection on the amount of revenue that that piece of property on the river could throw off. And someone said, well, we should call Dan Gilbert and get him to have his people give us a projection. And the very next day, he volunteered Matt Cullen and Jim Katai. They were both out of town. Matt was up north vacationing, and he came down in his jeans and unshaven and sat down with Fidget and did a complete prospectus on how much revenue that property could pull off. And it really helped us get the last deal. And now, if you look at that property, the Water Square Tower apartments are on it, and the new hotel going up is on it. And thanks to Dan and Matt and Jim Katai, we were able to put that deal over at 2:30 in the morning.
Well, that's when deals get done, right?
That's when deals get done.
Well, it's just another example. If you didn't have the grand bargain, none of this stuff happens. Why you had to clear the decks. And not only financially, but reputationally for Detroit. I mean, the fact that the bankruptcy was, once it's over, people stop talking about it. It's when it's looming over everybody's head that's when the issues were, I think.
Dan, when the bargaining for the bankruptcy was going on, were there days when you were really worried that you said, what have I done? I've got all this investment in this city, and they're talking about bankruptcy, and it's getting international attention.
There's definitely were times and days I thought that to myself, but there were more days where I just thought, you know, this city is too strong. There's too many people who are motivated not to have a bankruptcy, and you see two of them right here. But the collaboration that took place with the grand bargain between all the foundations, the state, the city, and the business community is probably unparalleled. And somebody should write a book about it, Jerry.
Well, you should ask, Dan.
We're all trying to help you sell this book during the holidays.
I asked Jerry backstage how our book sales going. He was a little bit modest, but I think they're going pretty good.
Good. Thank you, Dan.
So far.
There'll be more books for sale this evening.
Are you signing them?
They're all going to be signed, yep. Actually, you're all going to get a book as part of a gift bag, but it is around the holiday season, so you may want more than one.
Dan, if you can, give us a little sneak peek at the future, if you can, the Renaissance Center. 10 years from now.
Okay. Well,
what do you envision?
Let's go 10 weeks from now.
10 weeks from now, okay.
Well, first of all, we are under an NDA with both General Motors and the city.
And let me interrupt you a second. Yeah. I asked that because I don't think anybody has done a better job at taking existing buildings in the downtown in this area and remaking them. And you even took a couple media buildings in my profession when the industry wasn't doing as great, and you took it over, you kept the building, but recreated it inside.
Yeah, some of the media is not there anymore.
That's true.
That's unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not sure. But anyway, I will say this, that the Renaissance Center has huge potential. And the way we look at it, and we're working with the city and General Motors together, another collaboration. But how do we extend the Renaissance Center all the way to the river as far as entertainment and attraction? And we're looking at those buildings and how they can be sort of rehabbed and put back into play. I mean, it's a massive project, it's a massive undertaking, but we're making progress every day. And I believe 10 years from now, they'll be the jewels on the river again, maybe like they were at one point. It's amazing those buildings are coming up on 60 years old soon.
And how much of a shot in the arm from the business side, whether it was financial or it was just recognition that leads sometimes to financial, was the NFL draft with 750,000 people being reintroduced to the city of Detroit. Many people who had never set foot in the city before, but walked away with a positive attitude.
I mean, you just touched on the most important thing. To have 750,000 people come to Detroit and just walk around and feel it, like we were talking about earlier, and they go home and they tell all their friends and relatives about Detroit. I mean, you can't think of an event that would be better. Even the Super Bowl doesn't have near amount of people as that.
It's amazing.
But we're still hoping for that Super Bowl.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when we were talking to Roger Goodell, that's what I said. I said, so what do we got to do to get that next? He said, let's see how the draft goes. But the draft went pretty well, so.
Dan, a couple of years ago, you said to me that one of the reasons that you felt comfortable moving downtown was three things. One is that your young people needed public amenities like the riverfront or Campus Martius. They needed an active bar and entertainment scene, and they needed transit. They needed regional transit. Those three things have kind of coalesced. If you were to project out another number of years, what are the three things that this community needs in order to survive and thrive?
I think, first of all, we have to keep our young people here. Every time I speak publicly, I talk about that because I'm going to keep hammering it. It's just insane that Michigan, Michigan State, Wayne State, and all the other universities across the state are being funded by taxpayer dollars and mom and dad dollars. And what do? We ship off our young people when they graduate, or they ship themselves off, I should say, to New York, Chicago, LA, Seattle, wherever, and they benefit by all of our investment. And that's the talent that is going to create the economy of the future, and we got to keep them here. So there's a lot of ideas floating around on what we need to do that, but there are jobs now in the urban cores, which is where they want to work. Yeah. So that was one of the reasons why we made that big bang investment, because in our business, we knew we had to be an attraction for young people, but I think you hear that from most businesses. Mm-hmm. So I think that's number one. Number two, I do think transportation is huge. Yeah. I mean, you've been a big supporter of the Q line. That was an experiment. Mm-hmm. I mean, that little experiment, 3.5 miles, is now going to have over, 1.2 or 1.3 million riders this year? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's truly incredible. Mm-hmm. And we did that for two reasons, as I recall. Number one, we wanted to be able to move people up and down downtown, but the other one, and the bigger one, was to prove to the federal government that Detroit could get its act together and actually do something with rail. Because I guess there's been something like 19 or 20 attempts to lobby the federal government since 1900 to get a regional transportation system in Metro Detroit. And I can't think of a bigger thing you could do, not just for kids, but for everybody. I mean, just imagine transportation from the airport to here, Ann Arbor to here, east, west, north, south. It changes the whole region. And by the way, since the Q line's been in place, there's been $8 billion of investment along the woodwork. $8 billion.
$8 billion.
For just from that little rail.
Had we known that, we wouldn't have called it the Q line, we would have called it the K line. Sorry.
You just came up with that after all these years?
Takes me a while.
Dan, you're a hero of Detroit. You really are. And so much of what we are experiencing now in Detroit, we can thank Dan for his vision and his courage, because he believed in Detroit when very, very few people did. But the only thing I'd say, Dan, and I think I speak for a lot of Detroiters, is that we wish you had bought the Pistons and not the Cavaliers.
The Pistons are doing better.
They are.
We are 15-1 and all, but the Pistons are starting to do better. They have our...
Not as well as the Cavs are doing.
We'll see.
Give us a little time. Give us a little time.
Long season.
Quick final question, and I'll get us back on the time track here. Rip Rapson, knowing what you know now, if you had to do this all over again, is there something key you would do different than what you did before?
Oh. I at the risk of not being particularly self-reflective, I think no. I think what has happened is you've seen in Detroit the emergence of a way of attacking problems that doesn't just depend on Dan, doesn't just depend on the mayor, doesn't depend on the financial sector or the philanthropic sector. But we almost sort of engage in reverse engineering. We say, what's the issue we're trying to work on, whether it's blight or whether it's commercial redevelopment of the corridor. And then we ask ourselves, who has the tools to do it properly? And in what combination, what doses, what sequence, what speed? And I think we've seen that play over and over and over again. Dan once said to me that he had gotten outbid by another company for one of the downtown properties. And I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And he said, no, that's good. right? That's great. I mean, the more people we have in this mix, the more diversified we can create this recovery, the better off we are. And so I think what has motivated Kresge is to try to just figure out what its role has been. And that's a little bit, we don't have to play the same role downtown as we do in the neighborhoods. We don't have to play the same role on the riverfront as we might play in the Marygrove Conservancy up in Northwest Detroit. It's sort of trying to find what your appropriate role is and then finding the partnerships that make it happen. So I'm sure we've made some mistakes, but I actually think we've been really fortunate in that in all of the work that we've done it with partners. There's virtually nothing that Kresge has done alone. We couldn't have done the Q line without Dan or without Roger Penske or Matt Cullen. We couldn't have done the Marygrove Conservancy without all of the sort of the resources that Tom Lawand and other folks have done up in Northwest Detroit. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And that's why I talked earlier, Jerry, about the importance of the musculature of cooperation, because that's how we came to the grand bargain table. And I think what we've done pretty well since is sort of maintained that sort of sense of partnership and mutual responsibility.
I think, Rip, one of the more impressive parts of that is it's no secret that Detroit was not just Detroit, Southeast Michigan was not the most cooperative, collaborative place in the world. I mean, you had union versus management, you had
Absolutely.
race issues, you had east side versus west side, you had suburbs versus the city. I mean, it was not a place of kumbaya. And since this grand bargain, I think you're right, Rip, and Jerry, I think that now people are 180 degrees from that. How do we cooperate? Philanthropic sector, the government, the business community, citizen groups. How do we all get together and start rowing in the same direction, which has happened in the last 10 years. So as you look to the future, we need more and more of that to get this transportation thing done, keep our students here, and any other big projects that are ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Dan Gilbert,
Yep.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
Thank you.
all that you've done and all that you're doing. Thank you for taking the time to come
My
be
pleasure
part of
being
this
here.
panel this evening.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So, does this mean I leave now and they stay?
Well, we're going to all leave for a little bit. Rip Rasmussen, thank you. Judge Rosen, we're going to do a little, I think, reset real quick, and then he's going to do a little epilogue, a little reading from his book for you, and then we'll wrap up, and then he's going to sign autographs later, I think?
Yeah.
All right, sign autographs. He says he's become a rock star. All right, thank you.
Let me just say this. Without Jerry, there's no grand bargain, as you all know, and also there's no book. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
So I am going to do a reading, a very short reading from the book, but I've got some people to thank, and I want to do that first. I'll try to do it quickly, but there's a lot of people that I have to thank. First of all, for this evening, I want to thank my JAMS family, and particularly the leadership who made all of this possible. Kim Taylor, our new president CIO, Nate Brooks, our COO, Liz Carter, John Moss, Renee Spritzel, Brian Parmalee, all of them are here, and also our immediate past president, Chris Poole. But I really want to thank the team that put this together, the JAMS team that put this together, led by Joe Edmonds, who is the Director of Practice Development for our central region. And Joe did an amazing job. He was assisted by Crystal Carranza, who's a new member of our Detroit JAMS family, and Ossie Dane, who is my admin, and they just did an amazing job putting this together, far beyond anything I could have expected. I want to also thank my JAMS colleagues who are all here tonight. Jim Alexander, Judge Jim Alexander, Judge Wendy Potts, Judge Lita Popke, Judge Denise Langford Morris, Judge Victoria Roberts, who you met, Judge Phil Shefferly, Judge Richard McQuaid, and my old friend and colleague from Miller Canfield almost 50 years ago, Rocky Posa. I also want to thank Rip Rapson, not just for being here and participating, but also he and Kresge are helping to host this evening, so I'm extremely appreciative of them. And the DIA, Salvador, and Denise Charnas for hosting us and doing such a great job as they always do with the DIA. Can anybody imagine what Detroit would be without the DIA? Almost unthinkable. Also the mayor's office, Stephanie Washington, I think Stephanie's here. Stephanie is the mayor's chief of staff, who helped put that video together, which I found inspiring. I have a special thank you for my mediation team, who took a leap of faith and jumped into the breach with me when no one believed that we could resolve the Detroit bankruptcy. You met Judge Victoria Roberts. Chief Judge Sean Cox is here somewhere, I believe. Judge David Lawson, Judge Liz Paris, who came all the way from Oregon to help us. Judge David Kaur, who came from Chicago to help us. And the late Judge Wiley Daniel, who came from Denver to help. An old friend of mine, his widow, wife, Ida is here, I believe, somewhere. Can't really see out there. And also, my dear friend and strong right arm, Eugene Dreiker of blessed memory. His wife, Elaine, is also here, as are, I believe, a couple or three of his children. And finally, Gina Torrielli, who was our consultant, who turned into a mediator. And the evening would not be complete without my thanking the Grand Bargain Foundations. I'm not going to name all of them, they're in the book, but the vision that they had, remarkable. And of course, Governor Snyder and Michigan's taxpayers, and the DIA, its board, and all of its donors who contributed to that $100 million breakfast becoming a reality. So I'm extremely appreciative for all of them. So I'm going to read the last section of the introduction of the book. And I didn't know that Dan had a Big Bang Theory, but the title of my introduction is Detroit's Big Bang Theory, for reasons that I hope will be obvious when I finish. And I hope I don't tear up, because for me it's very emotional. This book is not so much a story about the tick-tock of the bankruptcy case itself, as it is about the collective heart of the people who made all of this possible in less than 16 months, warp speed in the highly contentious municipal bankruptcy world. It's often said that a successful story must have heroes and villains. There are many heroes and heroines in this book, but there are no villains. Although there was certainly intense conflict, high tension, deep antagonisms, and misjudgments, this is instead the story of the dozens of enormously bright, talented, creative, courageous, and incredibly dedicated men and women, the political and community leaders, lawyers and judges, retirees, financial experts, union leaders and their members, business leaders, financial creditors, and visionary philanthropic leaders, all of whom stepped forward together, many at great personal risk and sacrifice, to overcome doubt, distrust, cynicism, rigidity, self-interest, and the ghosts of the city's past failures, to piece together a universally agreed upon plan to rescue and give rebirth to an iconic American original. In a public square filled with pessimism, we found helping hands. In an era of cynicism, partisan dysfunctionality, self-interest, and civic irresponsibility, we found allies among people with good hearts, hard-headed common sense, and uncommon courage. We learned that even in a time of political polarization, with trust in each other, Americans can still find common ground for the greater good. All of us together planted a flag upon that common ground and walked away from our work with the hope that others might see it and follow its example. In the end, that's why I decided to write this book, the first telling from the inside of how Detroit was rescued from the brink of oblivion. It's a cautionary tale, but also an inspiring one. In this drama, Americans of all backgrounds come together to reaffirm our heritage of good citizenship and to offer hope to all American cities facing similar challenges. In short, this is the story of Detroit's own Big Bang Theory, of unrelated people and events colliding together by chance in the same time and space to create a universe of new hope and opportunity for a great city and its people. By a quirk of fate, I was privileged to be with this small group of extraordinary people at the center of the vortex of this Big Bang. This is the story of those people and the events that consume them. I hope this story will resonate in every corner of our country where faith in democratic government and civil discourse is flickering. Thank you.